Now, to my left are four very distinguished individuals, only three of whom are honorable. I'm sorry, but you have to be an elected official to be honorable, Doug. No, Doug Chapin is well known to everybody in the room. He's the founding executive director of Future California Elections and has just played such an important and critical role in launching the organization, helping it through its formative years, and accomplishing some really big, important wins in a short amount of time. And so we've asked Doug to moderate this panel of three very distinguished guests. We have three secretaries of state who truly, from all the states across the nation, are three of the trailblazing pioneers that have done some of the most innovative and important work in election modernization, ensuring that the voting process is simpler, that it's easier to become an engaged citizen. And so we're just so excited and indeed honored to have all three of these secretaries here today. So Doug is going to introduce them, but on behalf of Future California Elections, thank you so much for being here today.
You keep that. I've got this. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Actually, I'm going to stand up so I can see everyone. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm really honored to be moderating this first panel this morning. Vince mentioned the work that I did with the Future of California Elections, and it really is tremendously rewarding. I do believe and continue to tell people across the country that the work you all are doing in California is and should be a model for how other states navigate the challenges of modernizing and improving elections across the country. I'm fortunate in my current gig at the University of Minnesota to be able to take a national view of election policy and procedure across the country. And I'm really happy to be with this panel today because I think what you're going to see today and hear about is some of the most exciting news and developments in the field of election policy and technology across the country. We have three secretaries of state who are overseeing tremendous amounts of change in their own states, and they're going to talk a little bit about plans both here in California and in their home states to rethink the way we run elections in the 21st century and beyond. And so our three secretaries will speak in the order from your left to right here. The first is Secretary Alex Padilla of California. What I like about today's panel is that they all have something in common in that they're elected secretaries of state, but they come to that job with very different experiences. And Secretary Padilla is not only a former state legislator, but is also an engineer by training. And when people ask me about the work I do, I tell people it's a little bit like election engineering. And so while there are lots of lawyers in the practice of election, it's nice to have engineers as well because they not only know how things work, but also think about why. To his left, Secretary Gene Atkins of Oregon, many years of service in the state, but also in Washington, dealing with the ins and outs of policy, someone who knows how hard it can be to do what is known in public administration as the art of muddling through. And she has some really exciting news to discuss about the work that Oregon is doing. And last and absolutely not least, Secretary Wayne Williams from Colorado is trained as a lawyer, but also comes to the job of Secretary of State as a former local election official, one of those people who is in the role of what I call grenade catcher in their localities, who's actually dealt with the front line, working with setting up polling places, working with poll workers and the like. And so while all three of them have similar jobs in that they're overseeing state election policy, I think you'll see today that they also come with very diverse and rich approaches to the work that they're doing. So first, we're going to turn to Secretary Padilla. Secretary Padilla came to the job of Secretary of State after many years of discussions about the future of California elections. And in looking at the first year of his term, I'm reminded of the saying, somewhat cynical, that when all has been said and done, more will have been said than will have been done. That has not been the case with Secretary Padilla and California elections. I think the phrase "hit the ground running" was made for Secretary Padilla and his team in Sacramento. Lots of changes, lots of new ideas, and I know he's really excited to talk about some of the work that they're doing here, not just to expand participation, but to modernize California's election system in the 21st century and beyond. Secretary?
for not just your attendance today, but your punctuality. You're making me look good in front of my counterparts from Oregon and from Colorado. Before I get into a couple of the main points I wanted to make this morning, I'm really looking forward to the Q&A, kind of the moderated discussion part here. I do want to thank both Neil Kelly, President of the California Association of Clerks and Elections Officials, and all the registrars that are here today, good delegation present, as well as Jana, head of our Elections Division, and the Secretary of State's Office and her team from Elections Division. And I'm sure by now you all know James Schwab, because you all email him. And he responds to every single email. He organizes all the conference calls as we talk through issues and talk through legislation. But before I get to sort of what we're doing in the office that you may not already know, a couple other additional points of background that I think could be helpful in understanding both how I work and why I care so much about the work that we're doing together. Yes, I do have a background in engineering, but it wasn't until that first recount that I observed here in Los Angeles County close to 20 years ago that I got an appreciation for. All right, should I start over? All right, well, I was given this, I guess it's not working. So I wanted to share just a couple more things in terms of background that could be helpful in not just understanding me and how we work and why we think the work that we do is so important. So yes, it was touched upon that my background is in engineering, and so have an appreciation for all the systems that are necessary for the proper conducting of elections. And registrars know what that means, from equipment to ballot custody and accounting and all those sorts of things. But years before I ran for office, I actually cut my teeth in politics as an organizer before I knew what an organizer was or what that meant. You know, doing the grassroots work of either the storefronts or door-to-door, getting people registered to vote, getting people who are low propensity voters out to the polls, which is very, very helpful now in this capacity when the two questions I get asked more than anything else is, what are you going to do to get more people registered? And what are you going to do to get more people to vote? A lot of people register on their own, or they're brought up that way, or they hear it, you know, at school, at home, and other places. But clearly, you look at voter registration rates, and we have a lot of work to do. We'll get to that. My years on the Los Angeles City Council, even before I ran for the state Senate, included a time period when I was president of the City Council from the year 2001 through a good chunk of 2006. So if you all recall what happened in that 2001 to 2004 time period, you know, when you're president of the council, you don't chair budget or transportation or public safety. You assign other people to do that, but you end up chairing a committee in LA called Rules and Elections, right? It's all the other stuff that most people aren't really thinking about. And so it was in that time period post Florida 2000, you know, in and around the HAVA debate, and congressional action in and around the time that the state put forth the bond measure and funding for new systems. So at a city level, at a city that conducted its own elections, we were steeped into, you know, all of that more than a decade ago. So I think it's all very helpful background for me, in addition to the legislative experience that I bring to this office. And so I just got to admit, for as much attention that we got last year in sponsoring the California New Motor Voter, the credit really does go to Oregon for pioneering the way. When I was running for secretary, we had heard about the initial attempt in Oregon that came up just short in the legislature, but the seed was planted here. So just think about this. I get elected in November, sworn in January. I'm in Washington, D.C. at an Aleo function in February when the bill just races through the legislature in Oregon. And I said, well, let's ride some coattails here. If it's good enough for Oregon, it's good enough for California. And so that launched our effort to craft a bill that would work in California, working with the legislature, working with the governor. We got it passed, signed into law. We can get into the details of how the two bills are different, but yes, automated voter registration is on its way here in the state of California. So we can significantly take a bite out of not the 6.7 million anymore, but based on new numbers, more than 7 million eligible but unregistered voters in California. So that was a big, big chunk of what we did year one. This year, as I'm hoping you're reading the LA Times editorial this morning, our big priority is Senate Bill 450, which inspired by Colorado. can afford counties the opportunity to really modernize how we conduct elections from a voter choice perspective. So we'll talk about more vote by mail, more ways to return your ballot, because in California, we're already seeing the trend. People like to receive their ballot in the mail increasingly, but mailing them back in is kind of flat. People are choosing to walk them in. So affording more drop-off stations, ballot drop boxes, vote centers that give people the flexibility of going anywhere in the county and allow for real early voting in California like we've never seen it before. I've seen it work in Colorado. I'm sure there's some things I don't know yet about it, but overall, it seems like the results are great, and we think it's an attractive option for counties in California. So that's a big priority this year, and working with all of you to make sure the language is just like we want it, provides the same standardization with the right amount of flexibility county to county. We'll know we'll make it work and bring a convenience to voters, and ultimately more turnout, higher turnout. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And that's a nice segue to Secretary Atkins. The election world was, I think, abuzz is the right word, when Oregon enacted what's known as new motor voter. And I know that there were some political developments in Oregon which led to then Secretary of State Kate Brown becoming Governor Kate Brown. And so you not only had a new job, but a very big mandate to put new motor voter in place. And I know you've already talked in other environments about what that process is like, but tell us a little bit about new motor voter and how Oregon is taking it from idea to implementation.
Thank you. Now, if I turn that on, then you can hear me better? Is that good? Okay. Yes, it's true. In this, just this week, Huffington Post had a little anniversary sum up of our governor's first year in office. It's been almost a year since she took office, formerly Secretary of State. And she pointed out how it's very unusual to be the one who was putting forward major legislation, and by the time it was passed and got to the governor's desk, she was the governor and got to sign it. And so it was a very exciting time for her. I'm not an elected, actually, Secretary of State. I am an appointed Secretary of State. I'm serving the rest of Governor Brown, former Secretary Brown's term, and not running for re-election. But I have the unusual opportunity of stepping into the office at the time when this kind of a major elections change is being made. The legislation that was passed in Oregon was set to become into effect, had to become in effect on January 1st, so I was sworn in on March 11th, and obviously have spent a lot of time over the last year getting ready for this big change. As you probably know, Oregon has relied on mail distribution of ballots for a very long time, starting at the local level way back in 1981. And since 1998, by voter mandate, it did finally go to the voters of Oregon. All statewide elections and local elections are done vote by mail. As Secretary Padilla pointed out, voting by mail doesn't necessarily mean anymore voting by mail. It means getting your ballots, universal distribution of ballots to households, but by about a 60-40 ratio now, people return their ballots to drop boxes in our state, 195 of them across the state, or through various ballot collection processes that go on in the state. 40% still do use stamps. There's a discussion going on in the Oregon legislature as we speak about whether prepaid envelopes ought to be provided. So, you know, that process has worked well for Oregonians. We feel as though we still wear the crown going forward in terms of turnout, whichever way that you measure it, that Oregonians are responding and participating in elections at a higher rate than the average, certainly, and than by most other states in most electoral cycles. But I think we also recognize that we were kind of stuck plateaued at a place where that they were not continuing, it was not continuing to go up, and what are the tools available to make sure both more participate as well as still getting to the issues of trying to get people to make sure to return their ballot. Obviously, since the passage of the NVRA, Oregon, like other states, have been working through state agencies primarily, or the most numbers coming through the Department of Motor Vehicles processing. We found that we really were stuck or felt stuck in terms of knowing that there was a big drop-off between those who were eligible and coming into the DMV and those who were actually getting registered through that process. Many of you have worked in California, particularly now, at trying to make that system operate a little better. The different idea that we're doing in Oregon that came from Secretary Brown was to try to see whether a partnership with the Secretary of State's office that was modeled a little bit more on a vote by mail basis, in the sense that people would have the opportunity, if they didn't make a decision right on the spot, to think again about that opportunity. And then, of course, with the added attraction that if you didn't tell us no, you would be registered to vote. We had, I don't know that I would call it a luxury, but I would say it was the good fortune that we had a pretty good data gathering and record keeping process at our Department of Motor Vehicles. Oregon had sadly gone through some changes. The sort of good news for registering people to vote this way, bad news for people being able to safely drive in Oregon. We had passed and were able to give licenses to undocumented folks or residents in our state for a period of time. Fortunately, the voters brought that to a vote and took that away. So as of about 3 years ago now, the Department of Motor Vehicles was establishing legal presence and also coding citizenship in their system. What Secretary Brown recognized is that all the information that we needed to be able to register people to vote were in that system. And so we've developed a system by which folks at the counter are given all the information on all the many ways you can register to vote in Oregon, given the chance on the spot if they would like to, with a form to register. But they're also told if you do nothing and you meet the eligibility requirements for voting, you will hear from us, and we will follow up. And in fact, we started sending mailers to people who were eligible but did not register at the time. We matched them. We matched that data set on a nightly basis with our centralized voter registration database, and people who are not registered and did not register on the spot get a mailing, which encourages them to participate and to vote. It gave us the opportunity to add in communication around secret ballot, around the services that are available for disabled voters, about protections for address protection and how you might access those systems if that's important to you, in addition to letting them, with a tear-off form and a sealed envelope, postage paid, return to us and say, nope, not interested, opting out, or add a party registration to their voter record. We've been sending about between 700 and 800 of those every business day now since January the 5th, when the first mailings went out. I update my numbers every time I talk about this, so I always have to look at them, because we started on actually the 4th of January, and people have 21 days before they return that. We weren't able to say much in the first month except how many we had sent out. We weren't able to, and of course everybody in Oregon who's interested in these issues wants to know how many people are returning their cards, how many people are registering by party, how many people are opting out. And we're only now being able to really look at that data as the 21-day periods run for each of the people receiving a mailing. But I can tell you, by the end of the 17th of February, which counted for 14 business days worth of mailings, 10,200 of these mailings had matured by their 21-day period. And so that's the group that we can start to look at. So again, more than 10,000 received mailings, 1,559 returned their cards. There were 711 who opted out, and 848 who made a party choice. We'll see as we go forward with these kinds of percentages, and we will have monthly on our website, along with our new registration numbers that we do every month. We'll have now an Oregon Motor Voter page that will show you sort of the percentages and how that registration is happening. But the ultimate result is that we've moved electronic records for 8,300 new voters to the counties for the final steps that they take to see if anything new has come in from the voter since then, and get them finally registered. That's 4 times as many in 14 days as we were doing in a month in any other area. Obviously, we know that the next big question is going to be, will these folks vote? We plan to evaluate, obviously, that as much as we're able to do, and we have a number of researchers who are interested in that as well. My line at this point is, I can guarantee you more people will vote. Whether it will be in the same percentages as folks who took more proactive steps in the past, perhaps not. Eventually, I think this will become the primary way people register in Oregon. And the 2 other quick things I just want to mention, and then you can ask about them if you want to. The other thing that we've gotten out of this is about twice as many address updates as we were getting under our old system of data gathering from the Department of Motor Vehicles. In a vote-by-mail state, that's everything. We really assume that undeliverable ballots will be reduced enormously. Our national change of address participation has been very helpful with that, but this is coming in at a far faster, greater rate for us, and I think it will really shore up the accuracy of our voter rolls. And I know that people saw probably nationally some numbers that this would mean 850,000 or some huge number of voters. We are going to reach back, as we call it, into the last 2 years and do a separate special mailing to folks who the same data had been collected by the DMV. And we will be reaching back to those folks after the primary in June, where we have a little bit of a lag in our election activity for counties. So she says stop, and I'm going to stop, and you can ask me your questions. I'm just very delighted to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Secretary. So next up, we have Secretary Williams, and what he's going to talk about, I think at least in part, is a really exciting new development in Colorado, which is you hear about something changing the paradigm. That's literally what they're doing in Colorado. Those of you who are familiar with tech speak will recognize the current election system in most states is a pull system, where we pull voters into the polling place and ask them to cast ballots. What Colorado is doing is actually pushing ballots to voters and then letting them decide how to return them. And so what they call ballot delivery, what many people around the country call the Colorado model, is of intense interest, not just here in California, but in many other states across the country. And so having vamped long enough to get the slides put together, I will turn it over to Secretary Wayne Williams. Secretary?
Well, thanks for being here, and thank you for the hospitality from Secretary Padilla. And you even let the Nuggets win a game last night at the Staples Center. So I was there with my son. It was kind of an interesting time. Colorado has a history in terms of mail ballots. We were an excuse state for a long time. Then we switched to you didn't have to have an excuse, but you had to request by election. Then we changed to you could be permanently a mail-in voter. And as you can see, as we had a permanent mail-in voter option, that's what PMIV stands for, the number who became permanent mail-in voters dramatically increased over time. Till 2013, 3/4 of our voters had already opted for that. So at that point, the legislature made a change, and we moved everybody to automatically receive a ballot by mail. Now, we had odd-year elections. There are school and tax elections that were mostly done by complete mail ballots before that, but this is the first time that we did that for general elections. The major provisions, we changed the state residency from 30 to 22 days. All state and federal elections by mail ballot. You can register to vote on election day and vote the same day. We then run a national change of address check each month, and we use voter service and polling centers. Now, voter service and polling centers are, so unlike some of the states that have gone the mail model, you can still vote in person if you want to. And in fact, we have various formulas. Some counties have as many as 25 different sites. Some of the smaller counties have a single site. And you can go there, you can use same-day registration. Now, because you can go to any site in a county, we have to have every polling site connected to the internet so we can instantly mark you off if you have voted, so you can't go to each of the 25 sites in turn. That means that eliminates some polling places that don't have the internet connectivity, and it frankly eliminates some of our judges that don't have the computer savviness. I know that would never happen in any of the judges in California, but we have some who are not quite as proficient. So what did that do? That meant that we had about almost 2 million voters who voted in 2014, which is our first gubernatorial election conducted under this model. 5% of the people still chose to vote in person. That is their choice. Some of those were people who wanted to wait till the last minute. Some of those were ones who same-day registered. Some were those who were adamantly opposed to voting by mail. We did have same-day registration. That meant that we had about 60 of those voters who'd used same-day registration, of those 8,458, who when we mailed, the post office said there's no one at that address. And so we have a little issue, but we're working on that. This is the time frame. And so the large gold bars are, and this is by week, and then the last two are the Monday before the election and then the Tuesday of Election Day. And you can see that the mail ballots were fairly distributed. But if you look at those small gray bars, you see that almost no one voted in the voter service and polling centers until the last 2 days. And in fact, 83% of the people who voted in person voted in the last 2 days. And so the other 2 weeks, we had ghost towns at some of our sites. So what did this do to turnout? Colorado has always been a very high-performing state. We've been 3rd or 4th in the nation in voter turnout. That was true before the law was passed. It is true after the law was passed. So we had 55% using the traditional voted over registration. It went to 57%. So small change in turnout. Whether that's caused by this or not, I'm not sure, but we do know that turnout increased with it. And this kind of gives you the chart. So yes, voting and how you send out ballots is important, but the most important thing is still what's on the ballot. And that's true in every state. So you see that the presidential year is still 2.6 million people. So we just held an election. Over half of the people who voted for president didn't vote in the school board and tax election that we held statewide. Despite the fact we sent them a ballot, delivered to their mailbox. They could deliver it to any of a number of sites for return, or they could mail it back, or they could vote in person. And so it did not solve all of the turnout issues. We do a number of things. Secretary Atkins talked about the importance of the voter list. When you mail, it is absolutely critical that you know where people are so you can mail them. We use change of address. We use death reports, incarceration reports, citizen check. We passed a bill that automatically allows us to update your address when you change your driver's license, because not everyone rushes in to change their voter registration. Now, it's easy in Colorado. We have govotecolorado.com. It's online. We were the first in the nation to have a mobile optimized voter registration site, but it is not everything we can do. So, Eric, Electronic Registration Information Center. Part of my pitch to you here and to Secretary Padilla is join Eric. As soon as you get Eric is the states share information so that we can eliminate duplicate registrations across the nation. It is a voluntary compact. Pew Foundation is part of this and helped get it started and continues to support it. A number of states are members of it. Colorado was one of the originals. You'll see that Oregon is now part of this. And of course, part of this is you need to have a statewide voter registration database, which under Secretary Padilla's leadership, California is going to establish. So once that happens, we encourage you to become part of this because it is critical. We have a very mobile nation. And as people move from place to place, their first thought is not always, oh, I should notify my former state that I no longer live there. Maybe some of you people in this room might do that, but most people probably don't. So it is an important part. It also involves some proactive work to notify people who appear not to be registered, to encourage them to register. That's important. Even for states that go with the Motor Voter 2 process that Oregon and California are using, you still have some people who choose not to get a driver's license. You still have people who may have predated the time you're going back to, reaching back to. And so this does involve a mailing to anyone that appears to be eligible but isn't registered. We then use the national change of address. It's a very complicated slide from Denver that shows how they use the change of address system from the post office to help update a voter. So this cleaning process and the things we've done reduced us. In 2010, we had 7% of the addresses, and SCORE, which is our statewide voter registration database, were bad. We're down to 3.5% in the 2014. So we've eliminated half the bad addresses. And again, that's critical because that's 122,000 people that now are probably going to get the right ballot for them to vote and are going to have that opportunity. And so we've also gone through and used the Social Security database to compare to folks who may have passed away. Sometimes even though we use death records from the state, we don't capture everybody. And Eric, by the way, is going to add vote history, so you can then verify where someone has voted. Again, an important step in ensuring that people are voting. We want everybody to vote. We want them to vote once, though, and not twice. And so because in Colorado's model, you can now go to a number of different sites. We've eliminated most of the provisional ballots. We cut down from 60,000 just to 981 provisional ballots in the entire state in 2014. There are some areas for improvement. Voter service and polling centers are over-required in our state legislation. The county I used to be the clerk of, the largest county by population of the state, had 12 sites open on Saturday for 5 hours. So 60 hours, we had 5 voters come in. That's 1 voter every 12 hours is not a logical way to run things. So you can still get a mail ballot. We don't need that. So we've got some changes we got to make there. 24/7 drop box has become very important, that you have the opportunity to return that ballot. We've had Democratic primary for a sheriff decided by fewer votes than the number of ballots that got delivered late, because the post office has consolidated their processing centers in the rural parts of the state. It sometimes takes a couple days or more for mail to get there at times. We also need to tighten up the legal standards. In Colorado, if you vote early, when we mail you the ballot 22 days ahead of time, and then vote somewhere else, the prosecutor said, well, we can't prosecute them because they didn't violate the law when they voted the first time. So we're fixing that. We've already fixed an issue where you can just have intent to live, and then we've still got some issues with that number of 60 folks. And again, not widespread, but we have some very close elections in Colorado at times. The other thing you have to look at, and I was talking to Alex a little bit about this at breakfast, do you have a recall provision in your Constitution that has any odd provisions? So in Colorado, our recall provision says replacement candidates can say 15 days before the election that they're running. Well, how do you mail ballots out to people in that circumstance? So we need to fix a constitutional provision, and that's a little bit challenging for us. So, finish just as it says stop. I am on time. And so I appreciate the chance to be with you and look forward to the discussion we're now going to have.
Thank you very much. I do want to point out, whenever you moderate one of these things, you all tell your speakers that they've got 8 to 10 minutes, and being from the East Coast, that usually ends up being 15 to 20 apiece. So this is an incredibly well-prepared panel. So speaking only for myself, I would like to say thank you. I want to start with a couple questions of my own. And the first is about how these advances actually become law. Policy usually means legislation, and legislation usually means politics, and politics usually means some partisan disagreement. And if memory serves, pretty much all of these reforms that we've discussed today have involved some hotly debated, if not straight party line votes. Without getting into the specific points of view of the two parties, how do you deal with both getting something like this passed and, more importantly, for want of a better term, selling it to the parties after it becomes law? Secretary Williams, let me start with you, because I know Colorado's had the longest experience. HB 1303 was not unanimously popular or supported, although it now seems to be working pretty well. How did you get over that hump, and how do you get past some of the lingering bad feelings that it created?
So just I am the token Republican on the panel here today, just to clarify. And so I am, as 1303 was proposed, I opposed it because it didn't have some of the fixes that I've talked about that have since been adopted. It allowed you to claim that you lived in a place even if you only intended to move there, which is a ridiculous standard, I'm sorry. And the legislature fixed it once it was demonstrated to them by an activist who fake registered, I will call it. It wasn't illegal, but it pushed the edge of the law. We've taken a different approach since I've been secretary, which is to try to work with everyone to have bipartisan support for the issues we have. And I think in elections that's important because it really is the underpinning of our confidence in a democratic republic. So the driver's license bill that I talked about, which allows us to update your registration, we had two very conservative Republicans who were carrying this. In fact, one of them, Justin Everett, we'll see if this gets back to Colorado or not. His nickname is Justin Neverett. Never passed a bill, but he passed this one because it addressed both the issue you sometimes have from Republicans who say we want the voting rolls to be clean, and from the Democrats who say we want everyone to participate. Well, this mirrored and pulled together both groups, and so it passed unanimously. And Justin, Representative Everett, was describing this as kind of odd to have common cause there testifying in favor of his bill. But it was something where we tried to balance everything together. As we look towards some of the other issues that we're trying to address, so you can't vote twice in Colorado even if we're first. We have bipartisan sponsors for that bill. The Democratic chair of the House committee, the Republican chair of the Senate committee. So we're trying to work with everyone, and I think that is a much better process, and it results in a lot more confidence in the elections. And that's how we're trying to do it in my administration.
Great. Secretary Atkins, the new motor voter passed in Oregon on a party line vote, in fact, only passed on the third try, because Oregon was one of the only states in the country that actually expanded its Democratic majority in 2014. So given that you had no minority support for the bill, what's that been like through the implementation phase? Are you seeing the same kind of rapprochement that Secretary Williams is talking about, or do you feel like you have to sort of resell the reform at every step?
It has increased the high bar of making it work right. I would say it felt like more pressure to demonstrate that this could be done without the catastrophes that had become attached to it during the legislative debate. You may or may not know that Oregon was one of the big debacles around the health insurance exchanges, and we're now in litigation with Oracle for, I think, the rest of the state's life. And so anything new that involved, any kind of electronic connection between state agencies or any new systems, are you going to be the next Cover Oregon was, one of the big things. So we didn't have the same challenge ahead of us. We didn't have to create a whole new system. We had agencies that had a long history of sharing data, but we have older systems at DMV. All of those things were there. We worked during the rulemaking process. We went through every step of the Administrative Procedures Act stuff, even the things that we didn't have to do, so that we had a Rules Advisory Committee, and anybody who opposed the bill was able to come in and look at our first draft of rules and make their comments, as well as people who supported it or had particular issues that they wanted resolved. There wasn't, of kind of the major provisions of the bill, obviously in rulemaking we couldn't change, but the effort, I think, was important to make to, try to drive down to what are the real concerns about privacy, what are the real concerns about potential, fraudulent use of the system in some way, how can I answer those questions and best, deal with that in the rulemaking process. We had public hearings around the state. Legislators who were adamantly opposed had an opportunity, give them what they'd like, which is to tell their voters in their local area how much they hate this. That process was fun, but I think it it did, get the conversation going. It was important to put the Secretary of State in the position of, I want to hear from you how best to respond to this. We have been very fortunate. I suspect it will come in some form by some legislators that they'll maybe start hearing from constituents, I got a mailing and I shouldn't have, or I didn't get one, or, I got a ballot and who said they could send that to me, and some of that could happen. We have had very little. We thought originally that we'd set up a call center because in Oregon we're sending out 800 pieces of mail a day. You assume some people are going to call and kvetch about something, or I don't get this, or this is too confusing, or what are you doing? Very, very little, and none of it complaining or saying that the mailing doesn't make sense or any of that. We've had very little response, and the counties are not who ultimately set out the confirmation to the voter, you are now registered in this way, are not getting negative responses. But so, all credit. I think we worked really hard on the communications. Again, gave it to everybody who hated the bill and said, are there things here that we should be doing that will be helpful in that regard, and do the best we can. It's a volatile legislature at the moment, and arguing's going to happen.
Got it. Well, first of all, if you had the word kvetch on your conference bingo card, you can collect your winnings out in the lobby after this panel. Secretary Padilla, obviously California has a very different partisan balance than do Oregon and Colorado, but as you well know, it isn't any easier to get things passed. How do you deal with issues of partisanship, both in enacting your version of motor voter and your desire to enact some version of ballot delivery through SB 450?
Right. I mean, I think at the risk of oversimplifying, we start with, you just play it straight, right? Because walking into folks who view everything through a partisan lens, and it's not every legislator, but some, you're only doing this because it's going to benefit one party versus another, or punish one party versus another. Like, no. This is just, looking at across the land, these are best practices. If our job, going back to those fundamental two questions, right? What are you going to do to get more people registered appropriately, only those who are eligible, et cetera, but get more people registered and get more people voting in elections, just sticking to that frame is what carried the day. Now, it wasn't easy, even in a state with near supermajorities in both houses and a governor that's all Democratic. It was at times getting caught into, well, we like the concept, we want to do it this way. Nobody wanted to do it that way. And almost not getting to the finish line because of that. So look, I tried to get the new motor voter piece done on a bipartisan basis. I figured 8 years in the Senate, I built a reputation for reaching out across the aisle as often as I could. We knew legislators. I went to not just the Democratic leaders, but the Republican leaders, went to committees. I was even allowed to come into Republican caucuses in both the Assembly and the Senate to make my pitch. And it was great Q&A. And thinking, hey, there's hope here, And at the end of the day, party line votes. To me, a little bit of a disappointment. We still got it done. And I think I can still sleep at night because publicly, the only opposition we ever got was, well, why register folks automatically? Because it's not that hard to do so already. Folks who really want to, they can go online, they can go to the post office, they can fill out the form, right? And my response was always, well, I don't necessarily disagree with that, but our registration rates show otherwise. And if here's an effective, efficient way of getting more eligible voters on the rolls, why wouldn't we, right? As a government efficiency proposal, if you will. Privately, this was never said in any committees, but more than a town hall or two, from sort of political activist types. Well, wait a minute. If you're automatically registering people and government can't pick the political party for you, so whether it's on the front end or on the back end, you give the new voter, an opportunity to pick their political preference, short of them stating one, what are they registered as? Is it no party preference in California, or now this category of other, or whatever the tag may be in other states? You had the potential for overall voter registration to go up, but the percent of voters registered as Republican going down or Democrat going down for political activists on both sides of the spectrum. That was their concern. And I say, hey, wait a minute. As Secretary of State, that's not my problem. Right? I'm a proud Democrat. Most everybody here knows that, right? But that's a charge for the candidates and for the political parties to go make their case. And pretty soon, it's not going to be very difficult at all to re-register if you want to change your party registration. So, that's kind of behind the curtain, some of the stuff that we came across. I think proposals like online voter registration, which is done in California, but started off in Arizona, if I recall correctly, as a government efficiency proposal, has unfortunately gone from being, a good government best practice thing to a partisan issue. I hope automatic registration doesn't end up there, but it's looking kind of like it, or other proposals going forward.
You want to weigh in, Secretary?
Well, I just wanted to add in that, because I think both the other secretaries talked about working with folks even though they had the votes or had already passed the issue. And I think that's important as election officials. We have to listen to those who are making the objections, because sometimes the objection they have might actually be legitimate. And so one of the challenges we had in Colorado when it was passed is the party that was in complete control at the time didn't listen to any of the objections, and so we then wound up with a 100-page fix-it bill the following year. Many of those could have been avoided by simply listening to the issues, because we didn't have that dialogue like we should have. And I think that's important. Even if you've got it, even if you've passed it, you still want to listen to folks, because sometimes what they say actually has some legitimacy to it.
Right. Thank you. And I've got one more question. I'm just going to flag for my Q&A wranglers that we're going to go to the audience next. So real quick, and I want to riff off of something that all three of you have said in different ways. Talk about how, now setting politics aside, how these reforms, either enacted or proposed, will work in a good government. You talk about the address cleanup. You talk about, there's often an argument that the cost to set up these new approaches pays for itself over time. Are you experiencing that? Are there surprises, pleasant or otherwise, with regard to how this looks as a government function? And I won't dictate the order. Somebody feel free to jump in.
Well, I'll start since I started last time. First, online voter registration absolutely saves significant money and makes the list more accurate. Because if I'm trying to piece together what you wrote on a form, I'm going to get it right some of the time. And my daughter asked me why her name was spelled wrong on her ballot envelope that she got. Because the temporary person who was inputting her voter registration left off the E in Lindsay. And so, yeah, so I've got firsthand knowledge that someone inputting your address and inputting your name is not as accurate. It's also much faster and it's easier. So absolutely, online voter registration is a great system that makes it easier for people and less expensive for the county clerks, county registrars who are having to do it. On these other issues, Colorado's kind of, we're in the process, I think like Secretary Padilla mentioned, of needing to buy new election equipment. Because we have so many people who vote by mail, we don't have to buy as many pieces of equipment, so there is an actual cost savings. The operations system, because we've got the everybody having to have internet connectivity and everything else, and they're open for longer, didn't really change a whole lot, but the equipment purchase is going to be a significant savings in Colorado.
When vote by mail was first started up in Oregon statewide, I think a considerable cost savings was experienced. But of course, that's been 20 years now, and so nobody remembers much about that. But they do see continuing costs go up, and are concerned about those things. You mentioned the cleaner voter list. The cleaner a voter list is, the less expense there's going to be, the less hassle for counties and everything else. We have had to make an initial investment in the programming to create the interface between the DMV and us, and our Department of Administrative Services, which does the printing and mailing processes, what that initial investment is costing something. The counties were given a certain appropriation from the legislature to make up for the fact that they will be having, particularly when we do this reach back, kind of an influx of new registrants to do, and that will cost a little something eventually. I think it will reduce costs overall, the number of paper registrations that we're going to have for entry, and all of those things will go down. I'd like to mention another good government thing that we talked about a lot and with the communications. You know, you've all, if you've worked in state government ever, you work in an office and you answer the phone and they say, well, I told the Department of Transportation this, why don't you know it? You know, when you work in, you know, I worked in public health, so, you know, why I would know what's going on in the Department of Transportation. But people, government is government is government, and they come to tell people I've moved to your state, I'm getting my driver's license. The less number of different things and different places that we can make them go, the better. That was the whole premise, and one of the best premises around NVRA and starting this whole process. But the more integrated our systems are, the more deeper understanding we have of each other's systems and how we can take advantage of them in terms of the way they're doing business and improve it statewide. I think there's a really important value to the citizens from that.
Secretary?
So great job on explaining cost savings for online or electronic voter registration, the automatic voter registration, I think by extension, but in much bigger numbers, right? Because if you have thousands of thousands, or over the next several years, maybe millions of voters added to the roll because they're deemed to be eligible in California, just from a data entry standpoint, number one, but also think about how much money we collectively spend on voter registration efforts statewide, through government, through the states, through counties, through nonprofit organizations and others, when the guesstimate is about 90% of the eligible but unregistered can be captured over time through a program like New Motor Voter. We'll still need other outreach efforts to capture that other 10, 12%, but significant cost savings there. But because this is the future of California elections, let me talk to you about the positive perfect storm that's kind of coming together here. Timing is great. As you'll read about this week and in hopefully a series of newspapers, Neil Kelly and I are calling for the funding of the next generation of voting systems statewide. Think about where we've been for the last 16 years. Florida 2000, Bush v. Gore, butterfly ballots hanging chads, right? And so in response, a lot of people said, well, we can't ever let that happen again. We can't let that happen in Florida or California or anywhere in between. So Congress acted on a bipartisan basis. Can't tell that from the presidential campaigns right now, but Congress acted on a bipartisan basis when they passed HAVA, which, among other things, put billions of dollars throughout the land for new voting systems. That was more than a decade ago. And the California experience has been, well, some of that newer equipment is still in use. A lot of it was decertified by my predecessor for security purposes. And so bottom line is, depending on the county in California you live in, you either have old voting systems or old voting systems. And over the next couple of cycles, every county has to invest in something new anyway. And what we're providing for through Senate Bill 450 is a vision of what elections ought to look like in the future, and help that vision drive what those investments over the next couple of cycles by counties should be. Because who here wants a brand new BlackBerry 2? Right? Technology's come a long way in the last 10, 20 years. And our voting systems are no different. So if we know that technology exists that is secure, but allows us to give voters more convenience, more choice, et cetera, through the series of reforms that we've collectively talked about, why wouldn't we do that? And so yes, after initial investment, which we have to do anyway, we can save money over time. That's the ultimate win-win. You know, for me, increasing turnout is first and foremost. If we can save money along the way, even better, and then maybe earn bipartisan support for the vision.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, this is very unusual, but we still have about 25 minutes for audience questions. And so I've got a couple of Q&A wranglers in the back, and if you all would sort of spread out and look for hands, we'll try and move around the room. As they do that, a couple of guidelines. Number one, Shakespeare wrote, I believe it was in Hamlet, that brevity is the very soul of wit. Please try and honor the bard in your question, and please try to ask a question. Don't just put a question mark at the end of a speech, if possible. And know that these are 3 elected and appointed politicians, and so they may end up answering the question they wish you had asked instead of the one you actually did. So try and, hey, I'm from DC, I know how it rolls. Let's start right down here. The lady with her hand up here, right up front. He's bringing you a microphone, right hand.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. I just wanted to ask, for those states who have all-male elections, they often lower the number of places you can go to vote. How do you handle people with disabilities and make sure all of them get a good experience and an accessible way to vote?
I will say that our county elections divisions all still are required to accept ballots and help people vote at the county elections offices. The notion of voter centers is of interest to us because that could increase the number of places around the state where that's the case. But you always do have the ability to go to your county elections office or any of their sub-offices if it's a big county and vote in person. We have the various different methods for various disabilities so that people can vote that way.
Secretary Williams?
In the Colorado model, we have, in addition to sending ballots out to folks, we also have the voter service and polling centers. Every one of those has equipment that is designed to enable someone with a disability to vote independently. And as we go through a new system, one of the things we've done since I've been secretary is we've chosen a uniform voting system vendor. We had members of the disability community come out and test all of the different systems, and we actually went with their recommendation for the system going forward. So we do have both the in-person option and as well as the mail ballots. And there are accessible devices. So in the large counties, we have about 25 different sites. And because you can go to any place in the county, it is much easier for someone with a disability to get to a particular site because some of them are designed to be right along public transportation routes or in other places that are fairly easy for folks to get to.
And just know that we've taken that experience and that deliberation into account in how we crafted Senate Bill 450. So we're, whether it's not just accessible locations and accessible systems, but ultimately, again, options for voters, vote by mail if that's what you choose, that's what's better for you. If you want the in-person option, we have that beyond just the county elections officials office, but everybody deserves the right to be able to receive, cast, and submit their ballot independently and privately as well.
Great. I got Kim in the back.
Good morning, Kim Alexander with the California Voter Foundation. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really envious of Colorado and Oregon voters because you have a uniform system statewide where voters are all given equal access to voting rights in a uniform way. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that uniformity and whether you think it helps reduce voter confusion, if it helps save costs for election administration. And also, I understand Colorado is moving toward more uniformity in your voting equipment itself. I wonder if you could talk about that as well. Thanks.
Sure. I think it has a direct result in less voter confusion and a cost savings from government. And I think that those two things both help make it more likely for people to be able to cast their ballot. We've got a medium-sized county, Mesa County, which is on the western slope, which is where you steal our water from, in case you're not sure where the western slope of Colorado is. But Mesa County has, their initial bid from the vendor was just over $400,000. After we as a state went in, chose a uniform system, and negotiated with the vendor, because we have a lot more buying power. I mean, we're not all LA County, but because we have enough buying power as a state, we were able to negotiate the cost for this county down to $300,000. So saving a third, it would have been a third more, so 25%, depending on how you want to look at it. We'll go with a positive one. it would have cost a third more to go with their individual system. And so I think we can do it. It also makes training easier. And in Colorado, we, like all three of our states, we have some small counties that you sometimes have a complete turnover in your election personnel. If the clerk leaves and the chief deputy didn't get the job and they leave and there's no one left who knows how to use it, well, we've had that happen in a county twice that has a unique system that no one else in the state does, and that leaves us in a very much of a quandary as to how to make sure that that election runs properly. So there are a lot of advantages to going with that uniform system.
I think we all always have to be careful about how uniform we think we are. I appreciate your compliment that Oregon is. We have, and we talked about this a little bit when we had breakfast this morning, I think all the secretaries work very hard to respect the local authority, which is sometimes granted by statute in ways that you're not going to change and not likely to change, especially if you're not funding. I said before, I worked in public health, and I tried to get equal services to women and families throughout the 36 counties of Oregon, and it was a lot easier to make the requirements consistent when I gave them their federal dollars with which to make these services happen. That isn't what happens in the elections world, at least in Oregon, and I find that negotiation a bit different than I did before. I think every state that I've talked to about this has developed more and more ways to pick what are the most important things to focus on, what are the ways that we can help financially, which help create that partnership that allows you to require folks. But it can come down to, and I'm prepared this election season, I know our current governor, former Secretary of State, did send state teams down to go pick up a ballot in one county because somebody had made a mistake on their ballot. They wanted to replace it. They were disabled. The county didn't feel they had the resources to go get that ballot from them, was going to make them drive across not the Cascades, but the Coast Range to get there, and jumped in to take that step, and sort of leading by example, trying to support negotiation with what are 36 very different counties in our system is a tough business, but voters deserve our working on it day and night.
Secretary, no?
I'm going to take that up with the County Association of Clerks and Elections Officials.
See, I told you to answer it. Sir?
How do you target young voters in lower income communities? And if you guys want to make the transition to online voting, how will you create strategies or free internet for lower income communities?
I'll go first. On your second question, I don't think we're anywhere near ready for online voting or internet voting. So for both security reasons, privacy reasons, so I don't think that's a real issue anytime soon. But I appreciate the first question because we know study after study, research shows who is it that is the eligible but unregistered in California. And for that matter, the registered but low propensity voter versus the folks that vote every single time. It's disproportionately young people, disproportionately working class families, and disproportionately communities of color, right? So when we have a reform like automatic registration that over time will capture 90% of the eligible but unregistered, it's disproportionately registering young people, communities of color, right? The folks that you've asked about. And so I think it's a very progressive reform in that perspective, even though it's also sort of a government efficiency reform that we've painted. And I think the same applies for the other reforms that we're doing to get more people to vote and to vote more regularly, because the folks who either aren't registered and therefore not voting, or are registered but not voting regularly, the more we increase participation rates, it's those historically not as active communities that are getting more engaged.
And I guess Secretary Atkins and Secretary, have you seen any, and I realize the data is very preliminary in Oregon, but have you seen any kind of age effect, if you will, in the folks who are being pulled into the new system, or in the work that's going on in California? Secretary Atkins?
We've not yet cut it by any demographics that we have, which will be mostly county and resident areas and age. We do expect that there will be some of that, but stay tuned until we start really evaluating the data. Of course, it won't be possible by race or ethnicity to identify that, but I know that the coalition that worked hard on this bill and is now looking very much at the ways to take advantage of it and moving from a very voter registration drive system of their own investment into let's get the ballots in the door now, are feeling very positive about it. Particularly students, college students are going to be impacted. I think we're going to have far more of them. It's going to validate the big suspicion there's always been about college students, which is that they're voting at home and they're voting over here. They're going to be coming in through the driver's license or ID or permit basis, and therefore be tied to that community in a way. But as they move around within the county every semester or every whatever, they're going to be captured and their ballots will be counted. But it is something really for us to be looking at together as our data moves forward.
Let me talk a couple of eclectic things. One of the reasons I think having 24/7 drop boxes to be able to return ballots is so critical is because saying you can return it at your county clerk's office between 8:30 and 4:30 really isn't very voter friendly. For people who are working one or two or even three jobs, the ability to drop it off at any point, I think, is important. And if you looked at our numbers, it wasn't that we didn't mail people a ballot. We mailed them a ballot, but there were still over 1 million people that didn't vote in the last election. Almost half the people who had voted for president didn't vote in the last election. And so making it easy for them to return that, I think, is important. And so that, to me, is one of the thrusts of what we need to do is make that return part easy for folks, and having this 24/7 drop boxes does that.
Secretary Bedia?
Here's one other point I want to share, and I want everybody to take a mental, if not a written note, because I think it's a simple concept that's constantly overlooked, but it can be very, very powerful. One of the opposing arguments I had when the new motor voter bill was going its way through the legislature wasn't just, well, it's easy enough to register, so why should we make it any easier? But just because somebody's now registered doesn't mean they're going to vote. So why go through this hoops? Think about this. The 7 million eligible but unregistered people in California, eligible to vote, 18 years or older and citizens. But because they're not registered, they do not get the sample ballot. Because they're not registered, they don't get the voter information guide. Because they're not registered, odds are campaigns and candidates aren't talking to them. Through automatic voter registration, now all of a sudden they're on the rolls. Guess what? They'll get the sample ballot. They'll get the voter information guide. If nothing else, it's government's job to say, hey, there's an election coming up, and here's what's on the ballot. And if nothing else, that's going to drive some people to vote that had never voted before. And if the campaigns and the candidates that are smart are going to start reaching out to them too. So it's very simple, but think about how powerful that is for those 7 million people.
So let me follow up on the other eclectic thing I wanted to say is Colorado has extended voter registration, pre-registration, to 16 and 17-year-olds. Curiously, by the way, unaffiliates overwhelmingly, but Republicans are pretty soundly dominating the 16, 17-year-old registration over Democrats. But unaffiliates beating both of them by a lot in Colorado. The other challenge is if you increase, and so as a candidate trying to get the word out, to the extent my likely voter pool has now increased, it does drive up the cost of campaigning. And so we have to figure out, do we need to adjust campaign limits, contribution limits, spending limits to allow candidates to effectively reach a larger pool of voters?
We got that too. You're going to register more voters can be eligible to vote? Oh my gosh, we're going to have to talk to them. Yeah. Again, that's not my problem.
So If you had 1015 as the first mention of campaign finance today, you can collect your winnings in the lobby afterwards. This gentleman right here in the gray suit.
Morning, Jonathan Tran with the endowment. I just had a question in regards to how some of the reforms in both Oregon and Colorado affected language access, because a big part of participation and one of the barriers to it is folks being able to understand the ballot. But if it's sent out in English only or some of the languages, it makes it more difficult for folks to participate. How have you dealt with that, and has that been a deterrence along the way?
Colorado actually has a number of counties that are required to send out ballots in Spanish as well as English. But we only have two. I understand LA County has, I don't remember how many, but a whole host. And so in those counties, we send out, and I ran an election in one of these counties because I got hired to do it. We send out the ballot in both languages, and the voter can opt whether to vote in the English section or the Spanish section. When you get as many as LA County has, you've got to have some other way of addressing it. We have had some pushback from clerks who are going, I can't fit all this information I want to put on, like here's where you can drop a ballot, and here's all this other useful stuff. I don't have enough room on the ballot envelope to stick it on there in both languages, and we have not figured out how to always address. So I tell that county clerk, thank you for your concern. You're going to have to find a way to make it fit, and you can do it. It's just now in an unreadable font. And some of the helpful information they might have stuck in that wasn't required, they can't do because they just don't have the space for. Colorado's looked at the possibility, and not formally, but do we allow a voter to make a choice some way so that way they can get the ballot that they want, and allows us to more customize it and have that helpful information like here's how to drop your ballot, here's where you can do it.
This is a place where Oregon has a lot of work to do, and I actually had some arguments with the legislators who were moving forward on getting the postage piece taken care of so nobody has to actually put a stamp on the ballot, that I thought a priority, greater investment was going to be around language access that I think has to be improved in our state, and been pleased to, because of the coalition that worked around Oregon Motor Voter, although Oregon Motor Voter did not take that to a new level, it certainly means we're reaching more people who are in need of those services, and they have telephone access. We're in need of taking on this issue. If we, to the extent we don't have counties who are required to provide and therefore do a double ballot, it would generally be Spanish in our state. If anything, our percentages are not there. But we have begun to have that conversation about being able to pre-identify. There was a county in our state that actually did Spanish language ballots earlier than anybody else, and knew because of a population they wanted to reach in their state, and there was great reluctance to come and be one of those tabbed that got the Spanish ballot. And how to do this without a record keeping, how to do this in a way that works for everyone. I'm very pleased at least that there's a coalition now talking about it. I'm hoping the legislature will make it more of a priority.
Right down front here, sir.
Yeah, I'm interested with Oregon's new motor voter, because we now have that and it's going to be implemented. If you had any new technology or new systems that were created for that, and how did you deal with people with disabilities that came in that were getting a state ID and making sure that that process was completely accessible, and how you engaged people with disabilities in that process of developing any new systems for that?
So there were not new systems that were developed for that. The Department of Motor Vehicle systems were roughly in place. There is still some advocacy working its way in their own systems. We are now, nothing that we did over the top of that changed anything in terms of whether you were getting an ID card or any of those things. The one barrier that there is that we either need to approach in terms of changing our voter laws, or we need to, negotiate. And we actually, Disability Rights Oregon and us are about to engage in a follow-up conversation about this, is that the system that we have set up does require an electronic signature to do the matching that we do. And so for those who are in the situation where a guardian signs under Oregon law, that can't be the voter's signature. You can do an attestation, a document that allows you to do an X or something that is less than a full signature, but Oregon voter law doesn't allow the signature of a guardian. And of course they do in the DMV system. And so we're not at this point able to process those in the same way, and needing to engage on how we might overcome that particular problem.
Well, very good. I'm sad to say we are out of time. I want to thank our three secretaries. As you can see, the future is very bright in all of these three states. Lots to happen. It's not just the presidential election year, but a really exciting year in all three states. I'm going to turn over the stage to Secretary Padilla in just a minute, but just very briefly want to ask you to thank all three secretaries, but especially our guests, Secretary Atkins and Secretary Rogers.